The room went quiet so fast I could hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. It happened at my grandmother's birthday dinner, the kind where everyone shows up dressed a little too nicely and pretending old arguments don't exist. Plates were still half full, wine glasses sweating onto the tablecloth. My aunt leaned back in her chair, smiling in that sharp, knowing way she always did when she thought she was being entertaining. "So," she said loudly, eyes fixed on me, "are you finally seeing someone? Or are you still, inactive?" The word hung there, inactive. I felt heat rush to my face. This wasn't the first time she'd done this. For years, she'd treated my personal life like a group discussion topic. Who I was dating, whether I was experienced enough. Every holiday, every gathering, she found a way to bring it up, always with a laugh, always in front of everyone. I tried to brush it off. I always did. "I don't think that's dinner conversation," I said, keeping my voice even. She waved her hand. "Oh, please. We're family. Why are you so sensitive?" That word too. Sensitive. Something in me snapped, not explosively, not dramatically, but with a cold clarity that surprised even me. I realized that no matter how politely I deflected, she would keep pushing. She enjoyed the imbalance. My discomfort was entertainment. She leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "At your age, it's kind of a red flag if you're still private about these things." I looked around the table. My mother stared at her plate. My cousins avoided eye contact. No one said anything. No one ever did. And before I could stop myself, I said it. "At least I don't ask people about their sex lives to distract from the fact that I still wet the bed." The silence that followed was absolute. My aunt froze, mouth slightly open, as if the sentence hadn't registered yet. Then her face drained of color. "What did you say?" she whispered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. "You heard me. You spent years humiliating me in public. I figured it was fair to stop pretending your medical issues were some big secret." She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That was private," she said, voice shaking. "How could you say something like that?" The irony hit me immediately. Private. The rest of the night unraveled quickly. My aunt left in tears. My grandmother started crying. My mother pulled me aside and told me I'd gone too far. That what my aunt dealt with was medical and deeply personal, and that I had embarrassed her. In front of everyone. No one mentioned the years of questions. No one mentioned the comments. No one mentioned how many times I'd been embarrassed first. The next day, my phone filled with messages. Some relatives said I owed her an apology. Others said they understood why I snapped, but that I should have taken the high road. A few told me I was cruel. I kept replaying the moment in my head, wondering where the line actually was. I knew bedwetting wasn't a joke. I knew it could be tied to health issues, trauma, things people don't choose. But I also knew my sex life wasn't a joke, and it wasn't something I'd chosen to have publicly dissected. What bothered me most wasn't that I'd hurt her feelings. It was that everyone seemed to agree her privacy mattered more than mine ever had. When I tried to explain that, my mother sighed and said, "You know how she is. You should have just ignored it. Ignored it. Like always." I started questioning myself. Was I wrong for hitting back? Was there a difference between defending yourself and becoming the villain? Did intent matter or only the damage? I didn't feel proud of what I said, but I also didn't feel regret in the way people expected. I felt tired. Tired of swallowing discomfort so others could stay comfortable. Tired of being told that silence was maturity. I never got an apology from my aunt for the years of invasive questions. I did get a long message from her about betrayal, about trust, about how I'd crossed an unforgivable line. Maybe I did, but I keep coming back to this. If my personal boundaries had been respected from the start, none of this would have happened. So now I'm left wondering whether I exposed something I shouldn't have, or whether I finally made it clear that my life isn't public property. Ada for outing my aunt's bedwetting after she wouldn't stop prying into my sex life. After that dinner, the fallout didn't fade the way family drama usually does. It settled in. The first week was the loudest. Phone calls, messages, carefully worded texts that all seemed to circle the same idea. I had crossed a line. Not a line, but the line. The kind that, once crossed, redefines how people see you. What struck me immediately was how unified everyone suddenly was. Relatives who had never defended me before now had strong opinions about respect, privacy, and compassion. People who had sat silently through years of my aunt's commentary were suddenly very vocal about how humiliation was unacceptable. When I pointed that out, the responses were vague. She didn't mean it like that. That's just how she jokes. You know, she doesn't have a filter, as if intention erased impact. I asked my mother why no one ever shut her down before. She said it was easier to let it go than to cause a scene. When I asked why it was acceptable for me to be uncomfortable so everyone else could be comfortable, she didn't have an answer. She just said, "You embarrassed the family." That word again, family. My aunt refused to speak to me directly. Instead, she sent long messages through other people. In her version of events, she had been teasing, bonding, being open. I had been cruel, vindictive, and malicious. She wrote that I had weaponized something deeply painful and that I should be ashamed. I read that message more than once, because part of me agreed with her. I didn't deny that what I said was harsh. I didn't pretend it was a measured response. It wasn't. It was reactive, sharp, and designed to stop her in her tracks. And it worked, but I kept coming back to something that no one else seemed interested in acknowledging. I had asked her to stop before, more than once, politely, quietly, in private. She laughed every time, told me I needed thicker skin. Apparently, skin is only allowed to be thin when it belongs to her. As days passed, the conversation shifted from what she had done to how I should fix it. I was encouraged to apologize to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, to acknowledge her pain without bringing up my own. That expectation felt familiar. I started thinking about the role I'd always played in the family. The agreeable one, the one who didn't rock the boat, the one whose discomfort was easy to ignore because I handled it quietly. My aunt's behavior had been tolerated precisely because it landed on me. When I stopped absorbing it, the system broke. A cousin eventually admitted something that stuck with me. She said, "Honestly, everyone knows she goes too far. You just said the one thing no one was supposed to say out loud." That clarified everything. It wasn't that I had violated some universal moral code. I had violated the unspoken agreement that her behavior would never be confronted publicly. I had disrupted the hierarchy of whose privacy mattered. I asked myself whether I would do it again, knowing the outcome. The answer wasn't simple. I wouldn't repeat the words exactly. I understood why using a medical condition was damaging, but I also knew that staying silent had cost me something too. It had taught her that there were no consequences. It had taught everyone else that I would tolerate being exposed if it kept gathering smooth. What bothered me most was that no one asked how it felt to be questioned about my sex life. In front of relatives, no one asked why that was acceptable. The moral outrage only appeared when the discomfort moved in the opposite direction. Eventually, the messages slowed. Family gatherings resumed, just without me. I was told it might be better if I skipped a few events until things cooled down. That hurt more than I expected, but it also confirmed something I had begun to suspect. I had never been protected there. I didn't lose my family because of one comment. I lost the illusion that my boundaries mattered to them. I still don't feel good about what I said, but I also don't feel wrong for finally refusing to be the only person expected to absorb humiliation quietly. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about revenge or retaliation. It's about what happens when someone pushes past your boundaries long enough that your response stops being polite. So I'm left with a complicated truth. Two things can be true at once. What I said was hurtful, and what she did for years was hurtful too. The difference is that when she embarrassed me, it was considered humor. When I embarrassed her, it became cruelty. And I can't stop wondering why the standard was never the same. As the weeks went on, the anger in the situation cooled, but the imbalance became sharper. I noticed how carefully everyone tiptoed around my aunt after that night. Her condition was never mentioned again, not even indirectly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room. People watched their words around her with a level of consideration I had never been afforded. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, my own boundaries were still treated as optional. When I did start attending family events again, the dynamic had changed. No one asked me about my sex life anymore, but the silence wasn't respectful. It was punitive. Conversations would pause when I joined them. Jokes would die out. I became the one who caused that scene, not the one who had been provoked for years. My aunt never apologized. She never acknowledged the years of invasive questions. Instead, she framed herself as the victim of a sudden, unprovoked attack, and the family accepted that framing because it was easier than revisiting the pattern that led there. One afternoon, I tried to explain myself to my mother more clearly. I told her I wasn't proud of what I'd said, but that I felt cornered, that every polite boundary I'd set had been ignored, that I had reached a breaking point. She listened quietly, then said, "You could have handled it with more grace." That word again, grace. I asked her why grace was only expected from me, why no one had ever told Mayan to show grace toward my privacy. She didn't answer directly. She just said my aunt was fragile and that I should have known better. That was when something shifted inside me. I realized that fragility had been assigned selectively. My discomfort had never been considered fragile. My embarrassment had been treated as resilience building. Her pain, on the other hand, required immediate protection. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped trying to argue my innocence. I stopped trying to get people to agree with me. I stopped explaining, because explanation assumes someone is willing to listen. I did eventually send Maya a message. Not the apology everyone wanted, but an acknowledgement. I told her I regretted bringing up her medical condition. I also told her that my sex life was not open for discussion and never had been, and that her repeated questions were hurtful and invasive. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would require mutual respect. She never replied, and strangely, that gave me more closure than any argument would have. I came to understand that the issue wasn't whether I was right or wrong in that moment. It was that the family system relied on someone absorbing discomfort quietly, so others wouldn't have to confront bad behavior. When I refused to play that role, I became the problem. That realization hurt, but it also clarified a lot. I learned that setting boundaries doesn't always make you look reasonable. Sometimes it makes you look difficult, especially to people who benefited from your silence. I learned that calling out disrespect rarely earns applause from those who normalized it. Most importantly, I learned that fairness and peace are not the same thing. Peace in my family had always meant compliance. I don't think I handled everything perfectly. I wish I had stopped her earlier. I wish someone had backed me up. I wish it hadn't reached that point at all. But I also know this. If I had stayed quiet again, nothing would have changed. She would still be asking. They would still be laughing it off. And I would still be swallowing it. So when I ask myself now whether I'm the asshole, the answer isn't clean. I said something I shouldn't have. I said it because I had been pushed there, and the reaction proved exactly why I felt so trapped in the first place. If being the villain means refusing to be publicly humiliated anymore, then maybe that's the role I was always going to be assigned the moment I stopped being convenient. Time added distance, and with distance came a different kind of clarity. I began to see that the incident wasn't just about my aunt or even about that dinner. It was about a pattern that had existed long before I ever spoke up. My aunt had always occupied a strange position in the family, untouchable in some ways, abrasive in others. People tolerated her behavior because confronting it meant dealing with discomfort. And discomfort was something everyone quietly agreed to avoid. I had been the easiest outlet. I was younger, quieter, less likely to push back. When she asked about my sex life, it wasn't because she was curious. It was because she knew she could. She knew the room would let her. She knew I'd blush, deflect, or laugh it off, and the moment would pass without consequences. Until it didn't. I replayed the night in my head, not obsessively anymore, but thoughtfully. I paid attention to the exact second before I spoke. The feeling wasn't rage. It was resignation. A realization that if I stayed silent again, I would be agreeing to this dynamic indefinitely. That scared me more than the fallout. What bothered me most afterward wasn't losing my aunt's trust. It was realizing how conditional my place in the family had been. I was valued as long as I absorbed discomfort quietly. The moment I redistributed that discomfort, even imperfectly, the rules change. I was told I should have handled it privately, but I had tried that. More than once. I was told I should have walked away, but walking away would have meant missing every gathering, every holiday, every moment she decided to target me. I was told I should have been kinder, but kindness had never protected me before. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My mistake wasn't that I defended myself. My mistake was waiting until I was cornered to do it. I started setting firmer boundaries elsewhere. If someone made an inappropriate comment, I named it. If a conversation crossed a line, I shut it down without explaining. Not aggressively, but definitively. And I noticed something interesting. The people who respected me adjusted immediately. The people who didn't called me difficult. that told me everything I needed to know. Months later, my aunt and I still don't speak. Family gatherings are quieter now, more controlled. No one asks invasive questions anymore. Not just to me, but to anyone. That change didn't come from gentle requests. It came from a moment everyone agreed never to repeat. Sometimes I wonder if there was another way it could have gone. A cleaner confrontation, a calmer boundary, a response that didn't involve exposing something so personal. Maybe there was. But I also know that if I hadn't shattered the illusion that night, nothing would have shifted. The cost of silence had been invisible because I was the one paying it. I don't celebrate what I said. I don't feel triumphant about it. But I no longer carry the shame others tried to hand me. Shame belongs where boundaries are ignored, not where they finally snap. So when I ask myself now whether I was wrong, the answer is simple, but it is honest. I regret the method. I don't regret the refusal to be humiliated, and I refuse to believe that protecting someone's dignity should require sacrificing my own. If that makes me the asshole in this story, then at least I'm no longer the silent one. Eventually, the question stopped being whether I was wrong and became something quieter and heavier. What kind of relationships was I willing to maintain moving forward? I realized that I had spent most of my life confusing endurance with closeness. I thought that tolerating discomfort was the price of belonging. That being included meant being available for ridicule as long as it was framed as humor. My aunt hadn't created that belief, but she had taken full advantage of it. What changed after that night wasn't just how others treated me, it was how I treated myself. I stopped forcing myself into conversations that felt invasive. I stopped answering questions I didn't owe anyone answers to. When relatives hinted that things would be easier if I just smoothed things over, I didn't argue. I simply said I wasn't interested in pretending nothing happened. That response made people uncomfortable. Some tried to reframe the situation again, softer this time. They said my aunt had been projecting, that she had her own insecurities, that she probably didn't even realize how hurtful she'd been. I didn't disagree, but understanding her behavior didn't obligate me to keep absorbing it. Empathy without boundaries had already cost me too much. What struck me most was how rarely anyone asked what I needed. The conversation was always about repair, but never about accountability, about restoring harmony, but never about changing behavior. It became clear that the family's definition of peace required someone to stay quiet, and that someone had always been me. Once I stepped out of that role, the structure wobbled. I also noticed how the label asshole was being used less as a moral judgment and more as a warning. It wasn't really about whether I had done something objectively wrong. It was about the risk of me doing it again, of me speaking up publicly, of me refusing to contain discomfort for others. That realization stripped the word of its power. I thought often about whether I could have stopped sooner, whether I could have asserted myself in a way that didn't involve collateral damage. Maybe, but I also know how many times I tried to be reasonable and was ignored. Politeness had never protected me. Silence had never taught anyone to stop. The truth is, my aunt didn't lose her privacy because I was cruel. She lost it because she treated privacy like a privilege she was entitled to but others weren't. And the family didn't rally around her because she was uniquely harmed. They rallied because the rules they relied on had been broken. Rules that said some people can be exposed and others must be protected. I don't feel proud of the moment. I don't replay it with satisfaction, but I don't regret it either. It was the natural end of a dynamic that had gone on too long without resistance. If I could speak to my younger self, the version of me who laughed nervously and tried to deflect those questions, I wouldn't tell them to be braver or sharper. I'd tell them they weren't wrong for wanting privacy. I'd tell them that discomfort is information, not a failure. And I'd tell them this: when people only value you for how easy you are to embarrass, the moment you stop being easy will always look like betrayal to them. That doesn't mean you did something unforgivable. It just means you stopped playing the role they needed you to play. What settled in after that realization was a kind of emotional recalibration. I stopped scanning rooms for approval. I stopped preemptively shrinking myself to avoid becoming a topic of conversation. And I stopped measuring my behavior by whether it kept other people comfortable. That shift didn't make me lighter right away. In some ways, it made things lonelier. Family gatherings became optional instead of automatic. When I did attend, I stayed closer to people who treated me like a person rather than an audience. I noticed how often conversations revolved around gossip, speculation, and subtle power plays. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. My aunt remained a central figure in the family, still protected, still catered to. But something about her presence had changed. She no longer asked intrusive questions not just to me, but to anyone. The jokes were safer. The teasing had boundaries now. Everyone pretended it was a natural evolution, but I knew better. Change had come from disruption, not diplomacy. That didn't mean I felt vindicated. There were nights I replayed everything and wondered if I had damaged something irreparably. Whether I'd confirmed people's worst assumptions about me. Whether I'd traded long-term connection for short-term relief. But every time I followed that thought to its end, I arrived at the same conclusion. The connection I was afraid of losing had already been conditional. It depended on my silence, on my tolerance, on my willingness to be the softer target. I also began noticing how differently people spoke to me one-on-one versus in groups. In private, some relatives admitted they'd always found Maya exhausting, that they hated how she crossed lines, that they admired me for finally saying something. In public, though, those same people stayed quiet. That taught me another uncomfortable lesson. Praise without support is just guilt in disguise. I stopped expecting validation from people who weren't willing to stand beside me when it mattered, and in doing so, I stopped feeling responsible for maintaining relationships that only function when I accepted disrespect. I don't think I handled everything perfectly. I don't think what I said was kind. But I've come to understand that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all, it's self-abandonment. And restraint without respect isn't maturity, it's compliance. If the question is whether I crossed a line, the honest answer is yes. But the better question is why that line was never drawn when I was the one being crossed. I didn't expose Maya because I wanted to hurt her. I exposed the imbalance because it had gone unchallenged for too long. And while I wish it hadn't taken such an extreme moment to make that clear, I no longer wish I'd stayed quiet, because silence would have cost me myself. That's where I am now, not proud, not ashamed, just awake. And for the first time, that feels like enough. With time, even the need to keep explaining the situation to myself or anyone else began to fade. I stopped rehearsing the story before family events. I stopped wondering how I would justify my reaction if someone brought it up again. I realized that constantly defending myself was just another way of staying trapped in the same dynamic. I didn't owe anyone a perfectly packaged moral conclusion. What lingered instead was a deeper understanding of power. My aunt never asked about my sex life because she cared. She asked because it put her in control of the moment. It shifted attention. It made her feel superior, knowledgeable, untouchable. And the family's silence wasn't neutrality, it was permission. Once I saw that, the situation stopped feeling personal in the way it once had. It wasn't about me being desensitive or her being too blunt. It was about a hierarchy where certain people were allowed to invade, and others were expected to endure. That hierarchy didn't collapse after that dinner, but it cracked. I noticed small changes. Conversations redirected themselves when they edged toward personal territory. Someone would clear their throat, another would change the subject. The rules were suddenly visible, and that visibility alone made a difference. No one thanked me for that, but I hadn't done it to be thanked. I also came to terms with something uncomfortable. Sometimes you can do the right thing in the wrong way, and it still reveals a truth that polite behavior never could. I don't excuse what I said. I don't pretend it was measured or compassionate, but I no longer accept the idea that one sharp sentence erased years of boundary violations. Context matters. History matters. And intent, while important, doesn't outweigh pattern. The hardest part was accepting that some people would never see the full picture. They'd always remember the moment, not the years leading up to it. They'd remember the shock, not the buildup. And I had to decide whether I could live with that. I could, because the alternative was living with myself knowing I'd stayed quiet yet again. I learned that sometimes setting a boundary doesn't look like a calm conversation. Sometimes it looks like a rupture, not because you wanted chaos, but because the system only listens when it's disrupted. I don't recommend that path lightly. It's lonely, it's messy, and it doesn't come with neat resolutions. But for me, it was the point where endurance stopped being mistaken for virtue. hurt you. Now, when I think back to that dinner, I don't replay the sentence anymore. I remember the moment just before it, the split second, where I realized I could either swallow it again or refuse. That refusal changed how I see myself. I'm no longer the person who accepts humiliation to keep things pleasant. I'm no longer the person whose privacy is optional. And I'm no longer afraid of being labeled difficult by people who benefited from my silence. If that costs me certain relationships, then those relationships were never as safe as I wanted to believe. And that, finally, is where the story rests, not in justification, not in guilt, but in acceptance of a truth I can't unlearn. At some point, I stopped thinking about the situation as something that needed to be resolved and started seeing it as something that had already revealed its outcome. The tension didn't need closure. It had already taught me what I needed to know. I noticed how my nervous system reacted differently now. Before, when family gatherings came up, my body would tense automatically. I'd prepare myself mentally, rehearsing neutral answers, jokes, exits. After that night, the anxiety shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was clearer. I knew exactly what I would and wouldn't tolerate. The uncertainty was gone, and that alone changed everything. What surprised me most was how little effort it took to maintain my boundary once it was real. I didn't need speeches. I didn't need allies. When a conversation edged toward something personal, I simply disengaged. No explanation, no apology. And when people noticed, they adjusted, not because they suddenly became more respectful, but because they understood the cost of crossing the line. That realization was sobering. It meant that all the years of politeness hadn't failed because I wasn't articulate enough or calm enough. They failed because there were no consequences. The moment consequences appeared, even messy, imperfect one's behavior changed. I also reflected on how the narrative around family had been used to override my autonomy. Family was always the justification. Family doesn't mean harm. Family doesn't mean boundaries. Family means enduring things you wouldn't accept elsewhere. But real connection shouldn't require humiliation as an entry fee. I thought about how my aunt described my comment as betrayal. That word had stuck with me. Betrayal implies loyalty owed. It implies a bond that was broken. And I realized something uncomfortable. The loyalty had always been one-sided. I had been loyal to the family's comfort, loyal to its unspoken rules, loyal to its preference for quiet over fairness. The moment I stopped prioritizing that loyalty, I was recast as disloyal. That reframing helped me let go of the guilt. I didn't betray anyone. I stopped participating in a dynamic that depended on my silence. There were still moments of doubt, moments where I wondered if I had permanently altered how I was seen, if certain relatives would always flinch slightly around me now, if I'd become a cautionary tale. But even in those moments, I felt steadier than I ever had before, because being misunderstood was no longer as frightening as being diminished. I also noticed something subtle but important. People outside my family responded very differently when I told them the story. Friends, co-workers, people with no stake in preserving family peace didn't rush to defend my aunt. They asked why she felt entitled to my personal life. They asked why no one intervened sooner. They recognized the imbalance immediately. That contrast was validating in a quiet way. It reminded me that normalization inside a system doesn't make behavior healthy. It just makes it familiar. I don't know if my aunt will ever acknowledge her role in what happened. I don't know if my family will ever fully revisit the dynamic honestly. They might not. And I've accepted that. What matters is that I no longer measure my worth by how well I endure discomfort. I no longer confuse restraint with respect. And I no longer believe that being quiet is the same as being kind. If the cost of that clarity is a fractured relationship or an uncomfortable reputation, I can live with it, because the alternative was losing myself slowly, politely, and invisibly, and I already know how that story ends. The fallout eventually settled into something quieter, something final.